In today's lecture, we'll discuss about human rights. I do hope that you'll enjoy this episode. Let us, first of all, try to understand what are human rights. The word human means a person, and the word rights means things to which you are entitled or allowed. Freedom that is guaranteed. In other words, human rights are the rights we have simply because we are humans. Human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that belong to every person in the world from birth to death. They apply regardless of where you are from or how you choose to live your life. Human rights are inherent to all human beings regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without any discrimination. Actually, human rights are based on the principle of respect for the individual. Their fundamental assumption is that each person is a moral and national being who deserves to be treated with dignity. They are called human rights because they are universal, whereas nations or specialized groups enjoy specific rights that apply only to them. Human rights are the rights to which everyone is entitled, no matter who they are and where they live. All human rights are indivisible, whether they are civil and political rights, such as the right to life, equality before the law, and freedom of expression, economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the rights to work, social security, education, or collective rights such as the rights to development and self-determination are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. The improvement of one right facilitates advancement of the others. Likewise, the deprivation of one right adversely affects the others. Actually, non-discrimination is a cross-cutting principle in international human rights law. The principle is present in all the major human rights treaties and provides the central theme of some of the international human rights conventions, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. The principle applies to everyone in relation to all human rights and freedoms, and it prohibits discrimination on the basis of a list of non-exhaustive categories such as sex, race, color, and so on. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Human rights entail both rights and obligations. States assume obligations and duties under international law to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights. The obligation to respect means that states must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. The obligation to protect requires states to protect individuals and groups against human rights abuses. The obligation to fulfill means that the states must take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. At the individual level, while we are entitled our human rights, we should also respect the human rights of others. This is equally important. The concept of human security is based on the recognition that all persons are subjects of dignity and rights. The leading religious traditions like Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, in spite of their differences, contradictions and conflicts, share the same vision of commitment to respecting the dignity of all people and the restrained task of fraternity protected. Throughout history, different schools of thoughts converged in the generation and evolution of the consciousness of human rights, which were formally recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, protects individuals against human rights abuses and guarantees certain fundamental freedoms. The UDHR is a milestone document in the history of human rights. We should also remember that back in 1948, it was this focus on the value of the individual and the need of every person for protection that led to the UN General Assembly's unanimous adoption of the UDHR. The atrocities committed during the Second World War demonstrated the need for more than just peaceful relationships between states. Citizens were also to be protected against human rights abuses by their own governments. This is what the UN sought to achieve with UDHR. The declaration is not a legally binding document. However, through the general acceptance and practice of its principle as law, it has become the Magna Carta, an internationally recognized legal and ethical framework for international, regional, and national human rights mechanisms. It also serves as a source for other international and regional declarations and conventions on human, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Though this declaration is not a legally binding document, however, through the general acceptance and principles of its practice, it has been accepted worldwide. I would urge you to kindly look at the UN Convention to understand more about it. The UN and the human rights. The United Nations defines human rights as universal legal guarantees protecting individuals and groups against actions which interfere with fundamental freedoms and human dignity. It goes on to explain that there are those rights which are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, or any other status. Human rights include the rights to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, and many more. As the chair of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, Eleanor Roosevelt had said that the driving force in creating the 1948 Charter of Liberties that we know today as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, called First Lady of the World by President Truman for her lifelong humanitarian achievements, Roosevelt worked till the end of her life to gain acceptance and implementation of the rights set forth in the Declaration. The legacy of her words and her work appears in the constitution of scores of nations and an evolving body of international law that now protects the rights of men and women across the world. India's contributions to the UDHR are also of note, with speeches by Gandhi and Nehru regarding the injustice of colonial rule and the demand for self-determination being brought to the forefront of various discussions within the UN. At various stages of drafting, India was represented by Hansa Mehta, M.R. Masani and Lakshmi Menon. Universal human rights are often expressed and guaranteed by law in the form of treaties, customary international law, general principles, and other sources of international law. International human rights law lays down obligations of governments to act in certain ways or to refrain from other acts in order to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of individuals or groups. But there are certain variations in the conceptions of human rights. Human rights are broadly understood as inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled simply because they are human beings. However, when it comes to analyzing the intricacies in the understanding and the practice of human rights, academic study has proven that there are differences. This is especially noted in the legislation of different countries. Since human rights are first and foremost understood to be requirements to understand and protect the individual from the arbitrary use of power by the state, the recognition of these rights form the basis of legislation in the country. Research findings show that human rights can be studied as normative social representations, implying a degree of common understanding across common cultures together with organized differences within and between cultures. Important factors in modulating individual positionings in the realm of human rights are experience of social conflict and injustice, beliefs about the efficiency of various social actors to have rights enforced, and attitudes of liberalism or collectivism. On the other hand, an ethnocentric use of human right is well documented and has been experimentally studied. Generally, concerns about these rights expressed by citizens of Western countries become much stronger when non-Western countries are involved, whereas violations of these rights in their own country are often not severely condemned. Now, we must also understand that what is the relevance of human rights and why we must study about them. Human rights are relevant to all of us, not just because those who face expression, repression or mistreatment, they protect us in many ways of our day-to-day life, including the right to have and express your opinions, the right to an education, the right to a private and family life, the right not to be mistreated or wrongly punished by the state. Now let us look at the human rights perspective in India. Human rights in India is an issue which is complicated by the country's large size and population, widespread poverty, lack of proper education, as well as its diverse culture, even though being the world's largest sovereign, secular, democratic republic. However, it must be noted that these difficulties are precisely why it is so important for human rights to play a strong and firm role in India to ensure that the exploited are protected. The Constitution of India provides for fundamental rights which include freedom of religion. Clauses also provide for freedom of speech as well as separation of executive and judiciary and freedom of movement within the country and abroad. The country also has an independent judiciary as well as bodies to look into the issues of human rights. Now, let us analyze the scope of human rights in India. The idea of human rights principles are related to socialism, Gandhi's philosophy. The modern human rights arguments emerged over the later half of the 20th century against slavery, torture, genocides, and war crimes. The philosophy of human rights attempts to examine the underlying basis of the concept of human rights and critically looks at its content and justification. Several theoretical approaches have been advanced to explain how and why human rights have become a part of social expectations. So, where is the human rights in the Indian Constitution? Let us know more about that. The Indian Constitution has enshrined within it certain provisions for human rights in the form of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. These are broadly described like this: provision of housing. As per this human right, each and every citizen has to get adequate house for his or her surveillance. This is a natural right of human beings. Place of justice. In Indian Constitution, justice is one of the most important pillars and useful to humankind for overall progress. Civil and political rights. There are many human rights which bind to civil and political rights related to them. Climate change. Global warming and related components are essential to maintain suitable global environment in the world. Professional ethics and human rights. While pursuing work in an organization, every employee has to see professional ethics and human rights. The Supreme Court and the citizens of the country are increasingly becoming aware of and recognizing that the scope of human rights has a lot of potential to grow as according to the needs of the society that are constantly changing over the course of time. Through tools like public interest litigations, the Supreme Court has expanded the scope of fundamental rights like the right to live and liberty to further include the right to food, clean air and water, and also privacy. These monumental judgments of the Supreme Court of India are required to be reflected in the legislation of the nation, and therefore policy changes are made to accommodate and enable these fundamental rights as well. Although the directive principles of state policy are no legally enforceable, they form the framework within which the administration works. They represent the ideal which the nation must strive towards. Over the course of the years, many of these principles have been taken as inspiration for legislation to be passed that allow us to get one step closer to the kind of nation we aspire to be. So, which are the national institutions that specially look into human rights in India? Let us discuss that. The setting of national institution is one of the most effective means to perform the various functions related to the implementation of human rights. Such an institution raises human rights awareness through education, training, research, and conduct impartial investigation into alleged violations. It may also prove or secure effective solutions either by negotiation with the government concerned, or may assist the victims by providing relief through a court of law. The domestic institution of human rights may also influence the legislatures to preserve human rights in the widest sense of the term, and may also check the level and extent to which the government follows treaties regarding human rights. So, what is the National Human Rights Commission? You must have heard about it and read about it. Let us now try to know the basics of NHRC. The Protection of Human Rights Act was enacted in the year 1993. It provides for the constitution of a National Human Rights Commission, State Human Rights Commission in states, and Human Rights Courts for better protection of human rights. This act defined human rights by stating that human rights means the rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual guaranteed by the Constitution or embodied in the international covenants and enforceable by courts in India. The NHRC is an embodiment of India's concern for the promotion and protection of human rights. A look at the core groups of the NHRC gives us a brief idea of their goals and the issues they aim to tackle. These includes children, NGOs and human rights defenders, bonded labor, LGBT issues, business, environment and human rights, disability and elderly persons, health and also mental health, right to food, and women. Now, let us discuss what are the functions of NHRC. Now, you know what is the role of Human Rights Commission, but now we must discuss what are the functions. So, the functions are like this: to inquire into the violation of human rights or abatement thereof either on its own or on a petition submitted by an affected party or on his behalf by any person, or negligence shown by a public servant in the prevention of such a violation. To intervene in any of the proceedings pending before a court with the permission of such a court on any complaint of violation of human rights. The other very important function is to visit any jail or any other institutions where persons are detained or lodged for purpose of treatment, reformation or protection under the control of a state government with an advance notice to study the living conditions of the inmates and to make recommendations. Another function is also to review the safeguards for the protection of human rights provided by the Constitution or any of the existing law, and to suggest means to the central and state governments for their effective implementation. One more function is to review all the aspects that inhibits the enjoyment of human rights, including the acts of terrorism, and recommends the remedial measures to the Government of India. Also, to study treaties and other international instruments on human rights and make recommendations to the central government for their effective implementation. Another function of NHRC is to undertake and promote research in the field of human rights, to propagate the concept of human rights and to promote the awareness of their protection among the various sections of the society. It can undertake publication of books or pamphlets, or conduct seminars, or use the media or any other means available to it. To promote and support the non-governmental organizations and institutions in the fields of human rights. But despite these functions and roles, there have been various cases of human rights violations in India. This is a chart that you can look at. This has been taken from the website of Nhrc. There have been many instances of human rights violations, but if you study them very closely, you will find that generally there are 12 categories. According to an American newspaper, these are the 12 categories that we generally find as far as violation of human rights are concerned. First is abuses by armed groups. Then is the caste-based discrimination and violence. Then violation which is related to children's rights. Crimes against children rose by 5% in 2015 as compared to the previous year. An amendment in a child labour law by Parliament that allowed some exceptions was opposed by child rights activists who were concerned it would affect marginalized groups and girl child children. A new draft education policy released by the central government omitted any mention of human rights education. Fourth is communal and ethnic violence. Fifth is corporate accountability. Sixth is extrajudicial killings. Seventh is freedom of association. The Government of India cancelled the registration of several civil society organizations which specifically prevented them from getting foreign funding even after the UN claimed it was not in accordance with international law. Number 8 is freedom of expression. Number 9 is human rights defenders. Number 10 is number of cases which have emerged from Jammu and Kashmir. Number 11 is LGBT rights. The cabinet approved a flawed bill on transgender people's rights with a problematic description of trans people. Indians continue to fight for the discrimination of consensual same-sex relationships. And 12th is violence against women. More than 3,27,000 crimes were committed against women in 2015. So what are India's international human rights obligations? Over the last 70 years, India has signed over 15 human rights treaties with other countries. There are 5 core treaties, and these treaties are International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination 1965, which is also called ICERD. International Covenant on Economics, Social and Cultural Rights 1966, ICESCR. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, ICCPR. Then the Rights of the Child 1989, CRC. Then Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women 1979, which is also called CEDAW. Herein it must be noted that these treaties are not self-executing in India. The provisions of treaties do not form a part of domestic law automatically once they are signed. Instead, international treaties ratified by the country are looked at as a source of guidance in constitutional and statutory construction. Now, there is another important area that you must read about, and this is linked to violation of human rights in prisons. The condition of inmates in Indian prisons are downright considered to be inhumane, primarily due to overcrowding of prisons, lack of training personnel and infrastructure, and is deliberating with the governments of states and the center to improve conditions. Treatment of inmates in India is grim and secretly violative of fundamental as well as statutory rights of an individual. Instances of human rights violations in India are very common, especially in prisons, and almost even accepted by the people and the administration. The practice of torture in prison has been widespread over the years and predominant in India since time immemorial. Unchallenged and unrestricted, it has become quite normal and legitimate over the years, but one has to think about ways on improvising this situation. In the name of investigating crimes, extracting confessions and punishing individuals by the law enforcement agencies, torture is inflicted not only upon the accused but also on the bona fide petitioners, complainants or informants, amounting to cruel, inhuman, barbaric and degrading treatment, grossly derogatory to the individual dignity of the human being. The following list mentions a few of multitude of cases of human deaths in police custody, a glaring reflection of the violations of human rights in prisons. You can have a look at them, but it is also very important to understand why this happens and how this can be rectified. These are some of the custodial deaths that have taken place over the year 1995, 1996, 97, 98, 99, 2000, so on and so forth. Now, what is the role of judiciary in this? The Indian Supreme Court has been active in responding to human rights violations in Indian jails, and has in the process recognized a number of rights of inmates. Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, in the case of State of MP versus Shyam Sundar Trivedi, said that convicts are not by mere reason of the conviction denuded of all the fundamental rights which they otherwise possess. Prisoners don't cease to be human beings, and the Supreme Court has recognized rights of the prisoners so that they do not suffer, and a better rehabilitative surrounding is to be given to them to improve during the course of their jail term. Now, what is the conclusion of what we discussed today? Let us go through it. Human rights are for every individual. No one can claim on his or her basic rights. In Indian Constitution, specific focus has been given on fundamental and human rights. Human rights are beneficial and help to progress of human beings. It is a universal truth that man cannot develop himself without the basic rights as well as human rights. Human rights are political norms, morals, numerous and minimal standards, international as well as high priority laws. Human rights are independent and reference to evaluate the rules of positive law enforcement, legal institution and performance of the state. Proper implementation of human rights is the need of the time. Every person in the society should get the beneficial functions of human rights. These rights are only useful to the backward classes and castes with economical weaker sections. They are most useful to them and also to the minorities, but overall they are useful to everybody. Human rights are the features of life that allows us to fully acquire use of human qualities of intelligence and conscience. Human rights maintain the dignity and protection of human life, human rights of human beings. In Indian Constitution, Chapter 4 states the directive principle of state policy, which is dependent on the concept of human rights. Today, in the age of globalization, there is a need to establish, implement, and spread awareness about human rights for society to experience healthy and progressive development. These are some of the images that are concerning the various violations of human rights. And here are the key points of what we discussed today. Human rights are inherent to all human beings. These are something we are entitled to by virtue of being human beings, irrespective of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Everyone is entitled to human rights without any kind of discrimination. These are based on the principle of respect of an individual. In the past, there were no human rights. The idea that people should have human rights emerges in the wake of the Second World War. This resulted finally in the document which is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UDHR was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on 10th December 1948. 10th December is celebrated as Human Rights all across the globe. Human rights is a byproduct of democracy. It encompasses 30 human rights categorized as civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. There is a difference between fundamental rights and human rights, the main difference being that fundamental rights are specific to a country, while human rights have worldwide acceptance. While human rights are inalienable and indivisible, that is, they cannot be taken away from us, and governments should not be able to pick and choose which rights are to be respected, they are not vulnerable and can be violated. An important issue is how these rights can be protected. The Protection of Human Rights Act was enacted in the year 1993. We have various mechanisms to protect our rights. One of them is the National Human Rights Commission, which is also called Nhrc. There are also state human rights commissions and human rights courts for better protection of our human rights. In spite of the various mechanisms in place for protection of our human rights, there are a large number of shameful violations of our human rights. A shocking fact, according to the Nhrc, is that Delhi trails only Uttar Pradesh and Haryana in cases of human rights violations. Indian prisons are also an example of barbaric violation of our human rights. Overcrowding has been declared a violation of human rights, and the need of the time is to establish proper implementation and spreading awareness of our human rights in order to allow each and everyone to experience a proper, healthy, and progressive development. In this lecture series, we discussed about various forms of human rights which are important to each one of us. I would urge you to kindly look at all the important websites which are concerning human rights so that you are able to know more about them. Also, read about the cases of the violations of human rights in India so that you are in a position to understand what is the reality. Apart from this, you can also read some of the courses which are offered by number of universities related to human rights and prison reforms. I hope this was a learning experience for you. I would like to thank all the sources from where I have picked up some sort of information. Grateful to each one of them. These are some of the references. Thank you, each one of you.